whole book of Lamentations. An acrostic poem in the Bible is where each stanza or section or part follows each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so they tend to be long. Psalm 119, for example, is the longest chapter in the Bible. This one is quite long. And the purpose of acrostic poems, therefore, is not to simply declare a truth and then move on. Psalms are songs. They are meant to do something to us emotionally. They're supposed to tell us a truth and then work that truth so that we can explore it, so that it can burrow into our hearts, so that the truth, when repeated, can act like a solvent, working on the crusts of our worldliness, our psychological fixations, our deepest temptations. What is Psalm 37 about then? What's it dealing with? What's it focusing on? What's it trying to dissolve? And the answer is that the majority of people who give up on faith or don't believe in God or who are against it generally will say something like this first. I can't believe the world would be as it is if a loving and good God were governing it. But this psalm actually reveals and argues that that objection, though usually offered logically and philosophically, isn't logical or philosophical. We should know pretty straightforwardly in any kind of emotional maturity that we don't know this because we have somehow worked out all of how an infinite, nearly functionally infinite universe being governed by a perfect divine mind, working towards ends we may not know, only some of which he's told us we could ever know. The reason why this objection is so powerful is because we feel it so deeply. We experience the world. We experience what seems to be wrong with it. Things happen to us all the time. There are slights and wars and problems, and its emotional effect on us over time is to make us feel like believing in a God who governs a world who is good is just impossible to believe. But Psalm 37 is here to remind us that that feeling is both false and unfaithful. And it needs a direct treatment. And that treatment is a meditation on the goodness and justice of God's rule. 3 times in the early verses of the psalm, it uses the word fret, which is built on the Hebrew word for to kindle a fire. That is that don't allow this feeling of the impossibility of the goodness of God's governance be like a kindled fire burning bigger and bigger and bigger in your soul until it takes over everything that you feel. And so that you can't even think straight anymore. Don't let it burn in envy and in anger. Stomp on it. Smother that fire with the truth of the fact that God is a good governor of all things. The world seems out of control to us, not because it is out of control, but because it is out of our control. And that kindles in us an envy and anger and anxiety that erodes any desire or ability to trust in God. And it makes our hearts want to turn to the idols, the gods of control and power. We want to take control in a world that seems out of control to us. And then we find ourselves willing to connive success, to endear ourselves through flattery and dishonesty, to treat people with partiality. That is, those who give in to the idols of power and control don't just fret about the evil of the world. We become the ones who create it. Think about those themes as Becca comes and reads this psalm.
Psalm 37 of David. Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil. For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. A little while, and the wicked will be no more. Though you look for them, they will not be found. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity. The wicked plot against the righteous and gnash their teeth at them. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming. The wicked draw the sword and bend the bow to bring down the poor and needy, to slay those whose ways are upright. But their swords will pierce their own hearts, and their bows will be broken. Better the little that the righteous have than the wealth of many wicked, for the power of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. The blameless spend their days under the Lord's care, and their inheritance will endure forever. In times of disaster, they will not wither. In days of famine, they will enjoy plenty. But the wicked will perish. Though the Lord's enemies are like the flowers of the field, they will be consumed. They will go up in smoke. The wicked borrow and do not repay. The righteous give generously. Those the Lord blesses will inherit the land, but those he curses will be destroyed. The Lord makes firm the steps of one who delights in him. Though he may stumble, he will not fall, for the Lord upholds him with his hand. I was young, and now am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken, or their children begging for bread. They are always generous and lend freely. Their children will be a blessing. Turn from evil and do good. Then you will dwell in the land forever. For the Lord loves the just, and he will not forsake his faithful ones. Wrongdoers will be completely destroyed. The offspring of the wicked will perish. The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever. The mouths of the righteous utter wisdom, and their tongues speak what is just. The law of their God is in their hearts. Their feet do not slip. The wicked lie in wait for the righteous, intent on putting them to death. But the Lord will not leave them in the power of the wicked, or let them be condemned when brought to trial. Hope in the Lord and keep his way. He will exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are destroyed, you will see it. I have seen a wicked and ruthless man, flourishing like a luxuriant native tree. But he soon passed away and was no more. Though I looked for him, he could not be found. Consider the blameless, observe the upright. A future awaits those who seek peace. But all sinners will be destroyed, for there will be no future for the wicked. The salvation of the righteous comes from the Lord. He is their stronghold in time of trouble. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him.
Thanks, Becca. All right, do you have your scripture memory verse card? Obviously, there's one on the screen. This is for the whole series. And if you haven't gotten it yet, I've got too many pockets in my pants. If you haven't gotten one yet, then I don't have it in any of my pockets. That's fantastic. Oh, here it is. Let's say this one together. I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because he turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. If we look at the the content of this passage. Oh, sorry. If we look at the content of this passage, it is pretty straightforward what it's saying. Sorry, I'm disoriented. Negatively, it's saying, don't allow your heart to be kindled in anger and envy when you function in the world. And now, although there are many different kinds of evils in the world, right? There's natural disasters through to wars and all these kinds of things. I haven't met hardly anybody for whom all the non-human problems in the world are the reason they can't believe in God. They don't feel like they can believe in God. For most of them, it's stuff that has happened to them by other humans. And even if you philosophically believed that natural disasters and disease or whatever would be enough, we have no idea what the human race would have been capable of if we didn't waste all our time and money indulging ourselves and working on our own sins. Maybe we would have actually provided perfect remedies for all of these things in like a year after our original creation in our first parents. I mean, think about this. How big of a portion of our economy is sports, pornography? I mean, just name up all the like sort of vice stuff. I did put sports and vices, but we'll talk about that another time. But it's an enormous amount of resources we just spend on stuff other than curing cancer and building houses so people aren't drowned during hurricanes, right? That argument aside, what most people struggle with is wickedness, right? And what God is saying through this psalm is don't allow your anger and envy. So in the context, the envy is they seem like they're doing great. Those people who are worshiping the idols of power and control, I'm going to start taking control and do whatever I need to do. He said, don't envy them. And anger comes from anger directed towards God, that all the scheming seems to work more than it should and that it's taking place altogether. And so we're envious towards the wicked and we're angry towards God because it doesn't seem like the world ought to be governed like this. It seems like the world is out of control. It seems like we're out of control in it. We're in like a runaway train and we just want to do something so that we're going to be okay. And this psalm basically says, do not let that get kindled. Don't start that fire and put more wood on it and let it burn up. Don't allow yourself to continually fret over it and dwell in that anxiety, because ultimately the thing about fires is if you keep putting fuel on them, what happens to them? They get bigger. And he's talking about an emotional fire. You know what I'm talking about, right? When you start talking through something and fixating on something. Remember the last time somebody like personally attacked you and you were like telling them off in the car and in the shower and stuff like that, and it didn't help. It wasn't therapeutic. It just made you more angry, right? The human heart, human emotions just are full of that kind of thing. We don't feel better when we let things kind of kindle up. And so the remedy to that is actually, he says in a number of places, is to trust in God and to delight yourself in the Lord, right? And so the question then becomes, how? How do you do this? How do you learn to feel better, to get better at feeling by trusting in God and delighting in him, especially when the world that he is supposed to be governing seems like it is in lack of proper governance? I think there's a lot of people who in their more honest moments would say, if I was omnipotent and omniscient, I could govern the world better. Now, what this psalm is implicitly saying is that when that fire gets kindled, we fret over what is happening in the world, how it doesn't seem to be governed the way we want, how we feel like we're out of control in it, and we start to feel temptations towards anger and envy, and for those to burn up inside of us. What he's saying is he's saying it's coming from an emotion, a blindness to the truth that is created by these unfaithful emotions. Because remember, we're going to have a lot of unfaithful emotions naturally because we only see what we can see, right? Our five senses are incredibly helpful for engaging in empirical processes and not running into doors, but they're incredibly limited in their scope, right? Like I can see you and care about you because you're right here and I can see you, and I don't care about anybody I can't see because my senses focus me in on, I've been for my whole life mostly interested in the stuff I've been experiencing. That is, our senses, though they can open up our lives, their limitations close down our conceptions of life so that they get narrowed and self-focused and shallow. And they become a kind of foolish blindness because we can't see the big picture. And that's what David is actually getting at. What he's saying is that when we see in this cut of time, in this frame, we see wicked up, righteous down. And we go, in this frame, that's terrible. And God is saying, not only in the ultimate frame is it totally different, in the next frame it's different. But it's important to recognize that the reason this is a psalm is because if we are going to combat something that is untrue and that has an emotional fire inside of us, you don't just combat that with a little bit of truth bumping around in the noggin. Truth may be the sword, but you have to grab it and swing it with all the might of your emotion. You have to emotionally and passionately apply and utilize and rehearse and self-preach the truth. You have to take it up emotionally against the other emotions that want to lead you in an unfaithful direction. Listen, the emotions of envy and anger and lust are not going to quiet down on their own. They have to be met with equal or greater force, preferably greater. And you have to emotionally participate in that. There's so many people that just kind of slide intellectually and emotionally into things because when doubts came and when frustration came and when clouded thinking came, when all these things, they didn't stand up to it with the full emotion and mind working together. I don't know if you know this, but the Hebrew language just doesn't really have a word for just mind. Because they never thought that you would feel over here and think over here inside of yourself. We knew that 3,000 years ago. We just didn't know it 50 years ago. We're starting to learn again through brain scans, what we should have known throughout all of human history through written wisdom. And if you know that, then you have to take up the strength of emotion with discipline in applying truths, or it doesn't do it. Because the weight of emotion that you feel right at this moment overcomes in us the weight of glory that we won't allow ourselves to perceive. Okay, so there's three, I know you're really surprised at the number, sort of fretting blindnesses that anger and envy will produce, that we need to see the truth about and then begin rehearsing that truth again in our hearts. The first one is the distinction between the righteous and the wicked, which brings humility and hope. One of the things that we have a lot of difficulty with presently is this idea. And since most of the time we focus on the New Testament and how the New Testament talks about righteousness and wickedness, we focus on the fact that we're all sinful, the Bible says, and that through faith, God counts us righteous in Christ. And so we all come freely by faith. We all receive the righteousness that we possess. We cannot add to it in terms of our salvation. And so therefore, we're all in the same boat in all ways, in everything. The question is just, will we believe in Jesus? And though the Old Testament believes that, it uses a different context of language about human beings. And it counts all people distinguished among the righteous and the wicked. That in God's mind, he counts every human being on one team or another. And that distinction is actually the most important functional distinction in the mind of God. Of all the other distinctions you might possibly make. And in the Torah, when he's telling the Jewish people how they're going to live as distinct from all the peoples around them, he tells them that one of the most fundamental realities of what they must learn to be in relationship with him is to make the right distinctions between things. And so he starts with this whole thing related to food that he'd later get rid of. Right? In the New Testament, like, you can eat shrimp and stuff now. But for a whole long period of time, he's like, you need to live like this and not that. And he included it in a dress code, a shaving code, and a food code. Right? For like more than 1,000 years, like, guys had beards because they were supposed to look different than other people's. They wore certain kinds of clothes, and they ate and didn't eat certain things because God had designated one clean and one unclean. He said, you have to make this distinction between these two things. If you can't make distinctions, you can't be mine, because you can't distinguish things like righteousness and wickedness. In fact, the whole of the Torah is teaching God's people how to distinguish. And that concept is repeated in a number of places. When Solomon becomes king and he prays this glorious prayer for wisdom, one of the main focuses is, God, give me the wisdom to distinguish the right things from each other. And in Hebrews 5, when the apostle is writing to these folks who've been Christians for a while, and he goes through stuff that we would find pretty complicated. Like, most modern American Christians read the book of Hebrews and they're like, that was way over my head. It might be the most complicated book of the New Testament. I think it is. Because the way it works logically and imagery together, I think it's even more complicated than Romans. And yet, he gets to chapter 5 and he says, man, you guys, by now you should be mature. Because you just won't become mature, I got to teach you all the elementary stuff all over again, of which Hebrews is apparently all the elementary stuff. What would he say to us? And yet, when he says what maturity would look like, he says, for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves. So the emphasis here is not on what God graciously gives. The emphasis here is through the personal discipline of growing in something. Train themselves to distinguish, not between shrimp and beef. Not at this point in salvation history. At this point in salvation history, after the cross, the area of distinction that is focused on is very specifically between good and evil. And that distinction, how it finds itself in people, how people are either grown into righteousness or increasingly deformed into damnation, how that functions, what God is doing, and how that will ultimately work out is the main distinction that God is interested in. And it's not the main distinction we are interested in. And if we don't get that straight, then everything that God chooses to do, right, doesn't make sense to us. And the minute it doesn't make sense to us, that creates a foolish blindness in which we start fretting and growing angry and envious about how the world functions. If you can't see God using a world that he created good, that is under the curse, in which all these things are mixing around, as a place in which wickedness is being revealed for what it is, righteousness is being disciplined and built into people who have to fight a good fight amidst where faith has to be a choice and has to be embraced, where envy and evil and lust have to be attacked and fought against, and courage has to be built up, and that this is what God says he's doing among 1,000 other things. You see, if we won't see that, and we won't see this as the main distinction of what he's doing in salvation and redemption, and then ultimately in judgment and salvation, then we can't make any sense of the governing that he's actually doing. And if we can't make any sense of the governing he's actually doing, it will lead us to assume he either isn't governing or isn't good at it, which will produce in us fretting and anger and envy until we lose our faith, and or we embrace, in addition to our faith in God, the idols of control and power, and we do whatever we need to do so that we're not just fretting at wickedness, we're creating it. We're perpetrating it. Now, in our present culture, people are very uncomfortable with this idea of making distinctions, because in our present cultures, what people believe is that if we make distinctions, especially among people, that distinction leads to discrimination. The minute you can say there's a difference between two things or two people, now you have a basis on which to treat them differently, and now you're going to discriminate against them. So, and you can see this, people do this with religious people and irreligious people, act moralistically like this all the time. If people are afraid of this, it's because they've seen it happen. Now, if they're too secular to have eyes for this. They see it with religious people, and they don't see it among secular people. It is a universal human phenomenon. Everybody creates criteria in which some people are in and some people are out, and then they work those criteria to hold some people in and to push some people out. And it's very easy to do it religiously. It's very easy for me to believe I'm better than you, and so I'm in and you're out. And you're in with me, and you're out with him, and there we go. But that is not the way the Bible says that we solve the problem of human discrimination. The problem of human discrimination is a universal human problem. And the way you get rid of that is not saying there are no such thing as distinctions. Especially when in God's word he demands we make distinctions. What has to happen is we have to, through constant use and training, the mature learn how to make the proper distinctions, so that we make the right distinctions, and therefore we know immediately the counterfeit distinctions, and we can reject those and yet live rightly in accordance with nature and revelation in relationship to the distinctions that actually exist. So in Memphis, when people held up the sign, "I am a man," what's the argument implicit in that sign? It's your distinction is illegitimate. Distinguishing between people on the basis of their race or the color of their skin is an illegitimate distinction. Right? You can pay a sewage worker different than you pay a lawyer because they do different work. So that distinction to some degree might be relevant. But you can't pay sewage workers differently on the basis of their race because they do the same work, they're both human. It's an illegitimate distinction. The whole thing assumes that we make distinctions. And when we're thinking about how God governs the world and how we are going to live in that world that God governs, one of the first steps that we have to make is we have to learn to make distinctions. Now, this can lead to some confusion because if you read the Old Testament, there's a lot of talk about the righteous and the wicked. And in the New Testament, there's a lot of talk about all of us being wicked, and through Christ, through faith in him, we can receive a righteousness that's not our own. And so that leads some people to believe that, like, wait a second, though. Does that just mean like that the Old and New Testament are on totally different pages? And I mean, literally in the book, it is different pages. But not in terms of how salvation works or how righteousness or wickedness works. See, some people naturally believe, just as they read along and they don't pay attention to some of the details, and it is a big book, they think that this is how it works. That there's essentially discontinuity between the Old and New Testament. That in the Old Testament, good people are righteous and God loves them. They're the righteous. And God dislikes the wicked people because they're wicked. And in the New Testament, God loves people who believe and counts them as righteous. Okay? That's not really right. Because in the Old Testament, there are many cases in which it's very clear that people are saved by faith. And in the New Testament, there are many examples in which it demonstrates that faithfulness and holiness and godliness are a necessary part of salvation. That if somebody says, I believe in Jesus and I believe I've received his righteousness and that I'm going to heaven, and then they don't look at all like Jesus, like there's absolutely no distinguishing in their life, that their faith is actually false. That's not real faith. Faith always produces faithfulness. And in the Old Testament, faithfulness always comes from faith. Exact same thing, just said with reverse subjects and predicates. So that Paul can say in the New Testament with Jesus, we're saved just like Abraham was. God made a promise to Abraham, and God credited to him his righteousness. In 1 Peter, Peter could say, don't let anybody in the New Testament Jesus-believing church be godless like Esau, who did what? Who, though he was given a birthright by God as the firstborn son, he sold it for a bowl of soup because he was hungry. And so he basically worshiped the gods of power and control and took what he wanted and did what he felt like and didn't accept the way God had laid things out. And later he came back and said, no, I want my birthright. Well, I'm sorry, you sold it. And said he couldn't get it back even with tears. Make sure nobody believes in Jesus like Esau believed in his birthright. You see how the Old Testament are entwined this way? All the way through the New Testament, there's all these Old Testament examples of how it works. That only works if there's continuity between the two. If the righteousness and the wickedness talked about in the Old Testament was produced in faith, that's why the New Testament can quote, like I said last week, Habakkuk over and over again, the righteous one will live by his morality. What does the verse say? The righteous one will live by faith. Right? And so when you understand that distinction, Jesus is working redemption through faith, giving us a righteousness that isn't our own, transforming us through and by it, and making us like himself, so that through faith we will grow in faithfulness, and we will begin to walk as in this category of the righteous, those who trust God. Think about chapter 37. Trusting God, delighting in God is used interchangeably with righteousness. Because in the mind of faith in the Old Testament, the two are linked together. Those who delight in God and trust him will be faithful and godly. And those who don't, well, they miss the first principle of how to rightly distinguish a life under the governing God who makes distinctions. All right, we need to move on. The second is that that we need to see God's deeper wisdom through the apparent foolishness of his governance. So it is natural and emotional for us to look at the way the world is and be like, that is just stupid. Like, if I were omnipotent and omniscient, I wouldn't have to be any smarter. I could govern the world better than this. And the answer is, no, you couldn't. Not if you were after the same ends as God. Now, how does that work? So there's this verse that is very, some of you when you maybe heard it read were kind of like, oh, I don't know about, where David writes this. He says, I was young and now I'm old. Yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging for bread. They are always generous and lend freely. Their children will be blessed. Turn from evil and do good, and then you will dwell in the land. Right? Like, you look at that and don't you feel like, wait a second here, like, never? I mean, what David is saying, and this is a literal testimony of what he's saying. He's saying, I've been king over this country for decades. And I know that, like, it's normal parlance that, like, bad things happen to everybody, and isn't it crazy and random how some people have a bad time and other people have a good time? Has nothing to do with how people act, and like, it's just mind-boggling, and isn't it weird? Listen, what David is saying is, he's saying, listen, because of our unwillingness to actually call wickedness, wickedness, and righteousness, righteousness, and because of our ignorance about the lives of people and what happens to them, we come to the belief that what happens to people is generally random. And what he's saying is, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. Yes, there may be some, because this is a wisdom statement. It's not a literal promise that literally 100% of the time it works this way. There is going to be a certain group of people who are going to get sick from something that their lifestyle didn't contribute to. It feels really random, right? When I first got to High Point, there's a guy who was going here named Murley, and he was like, everybody's like, this guy is so awesome. And he got this like weird kind of disease, and he like lost feeling in his legs, and he got treated unhelpfully by doctors, and it was just a horrible ordeal. But listen, I've also been in ministry for 15 years. And I have counseled hundreds of people. And I could count on one hand the number of people who are having problems that didn't contribute immensely to those problems themselves. It's a fact of human life. And it's actually part of God's good governance in a world that is broken by sin. Let me give you an economics example of this. Generally speaking, in popular economics, not real economics, but popular economics, if you ask people, what kind of wealth do people need to be secure? They will give you the left column. Legal wealth, I have certain rights that I can appeal to, right? technological wealth. I've got these technologies, cars, smartphones, internet, so on, that can get me the entertainment I require for my personal salvation, that can get me jobs, that can help me communicate with people, right? That there's liquid wealth, that is money. That's the main one we want, right? Because we can buy the other ones. And then we talk a lot now about privilege, like stuff that's just gifting or position that you just got and you just have. And these are all assets through which you can get security for yourself, right? Now, in the ancient world, that is not how people thought about security and wealth at all. Yeah, people liked having stuff in the barn, and wealth was a good thing. And you could have wealth to a certain extent, but what people knew is that there were two main things that produce wealth. You and the people who are connected to you. Those are the two most trustworthy things. Your character, your capacity, what you are able to do, the skills you have built, the expertise that you've had, the failures you have learned from, all of that is what economists call social or human capital. Not too long ago, I was reading an article by an economist in which they were talking about studies where they estimated that about 80% of any person's real capital is in their human capital, not any of the other things. The Brookings Institute, which is a significantly to the left research institution in America, they said if you want a 95% chance of being in the middle class in America, you have to do three things. You know what they are? Finish high school, get any job, minimum wage, any job, and don't have children until after you get married. If you do those three things in America as it is right now, with all the problems in the left column, it's almost assured you will be in the middle class. Period, full stop. And that says nothing to do about the second category, which is social capital. Social capital are the people that you trust and trust you, feel they're bound to you in some way, and are going to be there when you need them, and you're going to be there when they need you. Family is the biggest example of social capital. Churches produce an extraordinary amount of social capital. Did you know there's only one place in all of America where sociologists can measure a steep decline in income inequality between races? There's only one place in all the institutions we have, in all the places that there are, there's only one place in all of America where you can measure a steep decline in income inequality. You know where it is? It's in churches that have more than 20% not the majority race, multi-ethnic churches. Now, that's not why we want to become a multi-ethnic church. We want to become a multi-ethnic church because Christ is for all people. The gospel is for all people. We learn to love better when people are different than us, and we have to figure out what they need, how we can relate, what is their heart's cry, how we can, right? There's all these spiritual reasons, but what are these things here? And here's the thing that we need to recognize. These things are secure things. And this column is actually pretty fragile. And one of the things that this psalm and all these other places in the Bible say about wickedness is that wickedness is a shortcut without roots. It creates something, but it creates something out of glass. It's fragile. And when something happens, it shatters. And so the wicked rise, and then they tell one too many lies. They get the wrong email found on their server. Their emails get hacked by someone. There's a recording of something they said offset. There's something on their credit card of a hotel they charged somewhere. And it just shatters. And yet, social capital doesn't shatter. Now, this may offend some of you, and I'm gonna say this because I think you should grapple with it depending on your personal beliefs, right? If you took me and you took away my degrees, you took away all my money, you took away my family, you changed my race and phenotype, and you put a basic drug possession felony on my record, and you dropped me off with nothing in a city I'd never lived in at a shelter, I would be in the middle class in less than 12 months. Because I can do stuff. Not just academic capacities, but like now listen, a lot of the reasons you could argue are because of privileges that I have, and I would totally agree with that. The argument that I'm making is this: almost nothing trumps human capital. That's one of the reasons that, what do you think we're doing here at church? What is God building into us through spirituality, through trusting him, right? He's building character and strength and honesty and truthfulness, not so that we can be wealthy. So it's just but that is the result. John Wesley said, listen, there was this huge revival in England, and people said to him, Wesley, what are you afraid is going to happen to the Methodists? He said, I'm afraid they're going to forget about God. And he said, well, they're mostly poor. Is it because you think they'll be so poor they'll get angry at God? He said, no. No, what happens is these poor coal miners come to Jesus. And when they come to Jesus, they come to small group. When they come to small group, they get discipled. When they get discipled, they learn how to work hard and that their life matters, and they start investing in themselves. And when they start working hard and they learn thrift and they do these things, they grow wealthy. And when they grow wealthy, they can take care of their own needs. And when they take care of their own needs, they don't look to God for their needs. And when they don't look to God for their needs, they lose their faith. My fear is not that the people of Methodism would grow so poor they would forget God. My fear is that the gospel must produce godliness, and godliness produces wealth, and wealth destroys faith. Unless, he finishes the sermon, they are incredibly generous. If the wealth their godliness produces, they give away so that they help others and are bound to them by love and still allow risk in their life so that they have to trust God, then they can increase their faith again. Which is why, did you notice generosity was covered a couple times in this psalm? Right? They give freely because they have faith, even if they have money. And I cannot tell you how many people their lives have shattered, sometimes because of their own wickedness, but who were part of the church or turned to the church, and the social capital of the church helped build around them and got them going in the right direction again. I had a friend who was a builder for a number of years, and he said that when he built houses, everybody always wants sod. Because who wants to move into a house, their brand new house that they paid X number of dollars for, and drive up and there's just sand and dirt everywhere, and a really pretty house? Nobody wants that. And so they pay the extra $15,000 for the sprinkler system, and they put in sod, and the first day that they pull up, the grass is green and growing, and they're like, we're going to have to mow, right? And then everybody does it because nobody wants to be that house, right? But he says, you go back 2 years later, especially if there's any kind of drought, and the sod is always the first to die. It turns yellow, and the Japanese beetles attack it because they can get under it, because sod never really roots right. You've cut off all those roots, then you lay it down, and as long as there's water in the first 2 inches, it's fine. But whenever there isn't water in the first 2 inches, they really don't have tap roots, because tap roots go down when seeds germinate. And for a lot of plants like grass, they don't grow again if you cut them. Not really. They'll grow new stuff out, but they don't really grow down. And yet the person who dealt with the dirt and the hay and grew grass from nothing doesn't have the beetles, weeds, doesn't rain for 2 months, 3 months, their grass is still green, because the roots go down layer after layer after layer after layer. It's not fragile. And you see, when we turn ourselves to the idols of power and control, you can build something. You can lay the sod, like you can get ahead. You can totally do it. But that's why Psalm 37 over and over again warns, yeah, but then the wicked just disappear. Like, did you hear the verse where he's like, there was a guy and he was wicked and he was flourishing, and then I looked for him and I couldn't even find him. He wasn't playing like hide and seek. What he's trying to teach in that is that there's this evaporation, this withering. He's like, the wicked are like the grass of the field. They're like the flowers that come up one day and then the goats eat them and then poop them out. Like, they're gone. They crash. And yet, he says, the righteous, like when something happens, there's all this like malleability. Like, you can't take away their human capital. They are who they are. Character always steps forward. It finds courage. It does something. It makes choices. It doesn't make the tragedy worse. One of the things that you find with people whose character is not well formed is what happens when something bad happens to them. What happens? Right? They do something to make it worse. And then what happens? They do something that makes it worse. And it becomes this self-fulfilling cycle. And the first things I often do in counseling is I go, stop, just stop. just do nothing. Just stop. Because that's what brokenness, that's what wickedness does. That's how we destroy ourselves, and we just break and tear up and uproot everything. But when you try to, by faith, grow in character and grow into maturity and make the right distinctions and be formed in godliness, when that happens, it creates a kind of solidity that most people can't see and most people don't have faith for, because they haven't troubled themselves in maturity to understand how these things work, because there's no wisdom in their hearts, because they don't have faith that God would teach them wisdom if they asked for it. And then they're lost without it. And I don't say that because their pain is trivial. I say that because we should be a people that invite those people in, but help them figure out how to tear up the sod and plant grass in their life. So however much money they have, or however much privilege they have, or however how many legal rights they have, they would have the true wealth of love and character, which we use the antiseptic words of human capital and social capital. But what economics can study, God has known since he made people, and it's part of the governance of his world. Brings us to the third thing, which is that God works actively on different time scales at different ends. There's just one main thing I want to look at here, and that is Jonathan Edwards in his book, which is only 50 pages. It is very difficult reading. I'll tell you that before you try it. Called The Nature of True Virtue. Actually, it's a much longer 18th century title than that. The Nature of True Virtue. He says this: people complain about the governance of God. The governance of God is amazing, because in a sinful world, he has put certain structures and natural consequences and realities into the world in terms of how it functions, so that without God's obvious appearance, wisdom and godliness tends to lead to prosperity and blessing and security, and wickedness tends to float people up and then crash and burn. So that if people naturally would observe, they would be able to see the truth even without believing in God. And then if faith is added to that, it would increase that capacity, and the actual transformation of faith would make things take off very quickly. But also built into it are certain dynamics in which people are not as bad as they would otherwise be if they choose not to trust God. Edwards calls this common virtue. So there's a certain amount of pride that you can give yourself to, but there's another level of pride that if you give yourself to it, even wicked people are going to nail you down. There's a certain amount of lust, a certain amount of greed, there's a certain amount of things, a certain amount of lies, a certain amount of wickedness that you can sort of get away with, but all other sinful human beings know that if they let you get away with too much, like you're going to extract from them and it's going to get ugly. And so there's this means by which God has ordered the natural common grace of the world to increase common virtue in wicked hearts, so that while people are being called to faith and being deformed in wickedness and choosing who and what they're going to be, and God is working in hearts and inviting people through the gospel and speaking and showing himself to the world and calling them to believe by faith and changing them through the Spirit, while all that is going on, he has so rigged the internal governance of things that things actually don't get as bad as they could be and remain a proper environmental context in which he both sorts the wicked and the righteous, he creates wickedness and righteousness. Wickedness basically creates itself. But he causes people to repent and turn away and do other things, so he can serve the ultimate goal of salvation and true virtue. Heaven will not have many of these basic constraints of how we keep each other in line because of our selfishness. Does that make sense? And so God has so contrived a world so that in wickedness and under the curse it would not become as bad as possible, but would become a nearly ideal laboratory for which joy can be found, pleasure can be experienced, love can be engaged in, all the human goods can be found, grown in, and experienced. And most human evils as well. in which wicked people are bound together by nature not to allow things to get as bad as they possibly can be, and where in that nature, truth and falsity, good and evil, are displayed naturally if we would pay attention. And in addition to that, God speaks and shows himself in creation, in the written scriptures, in the heart of human beings, and in the nature of conscience, and in his written word. All through the activity of his Spirit to lead to the redemption of the maximum possible people to ultimate blessing in true virtue. Now, if you can get a handle on that, now obviously Edwards doesn't know as much about God as God knows about how he's governing the world. And there's lots of other angles and lots of other things. But the way Edwards lays it out begins to show how we tend to be really childish in how we look at how God must be governing or not governing the world. And it allows us to recognize that because God is seeking this end on a different timetable, when the wicked are doing all their stuff, he laughs. Because he knows what ends he's bringing about. And he's not in a big rush because he doesn't have 5 senses sitting in that seat. That's not how he sees the universe. That's not how he sees reality. We are limited by space and time in a way that makes us incredibly ignorant in ways we can't fathom. And so when you get to the end of this section that I read about he says, therefore turn from evil and do good. You guys come on up and I'll end here real quick. Turn from evil, the musicians. Turn from evil and do good. And what he means by that is, because of the grace of God, God makes all kinds of distinctions, specifically this one. But the thing that is different in God's heart than ours is he lets people change teams. He will let people change teams from the righteous to the wicked, it says in Ezekiel 18. But the main emphasis of all the Bible is inviting people to change teams from the wicked to the righteous. The Bible is full of these invitations on every page. You may have been part of the wicked team your whole life. You may be just on that track, and you can change teams right now. God's draft is always open. He has no salary cap, and there's never too many players. You can change right now. He says, if anybody, and it's Ezekiel 18, if anybody ever, no matter how much wickedness they've done, if they turn, and they turn in faith and walk in faithfulness with me, by trusting and delighting in me, he says, I will not count against, I will forget all the wickedness that they have done. In Isaiah 55, he says, let the wicked man turn to the Lord, for he will freely pardon. The reason that is possible is because there was one righteous who was treated maximally unfairly. There was one person who was the only person who was on the righteousness chain from birth to death, but was treated like he was maximally wicked. Jesus, crucified for you to create the possibility that you could walk from one to the other, that you could let go the mental blindnesses, that you could put out the fire of envy and anger, that you could stop fretting about the way the world is, and you could actually delight in the Lord and all his wisdom of the governance of all things, and you could face all hardship as discipline, creating true virtue in you and allowing you to participate in others, in and with others in a work of love that is maximizing redemption in the world that you and I are made to be a part of. And that can happen, if it hasn't happened for you yet, right this second. If you will turn from evil and do good by starting with turning from evil to God and entrusting his way of drawing you to himself, that is Jesus crucified and risen for you.